Everybody, and welcome back to the channel. I'd just like to apologise first of all for it being so long since the last episode came out. I've just been really busy with work, and to be honest, I've had a bit of a break from Napoleonics for a couple of weeks. I've been playing a lot of World War II, Flames of War, and I've also been enjoying some Team Yankee, and I've been cracking on with some biblical ancients as well. So apologies, but I've just been feeling a little bit burned out on Napoleonics recently. Don't worry though, I haven't been completely ignoring them. I have been on and off painting up a unit of Italian line infantry, so I'll hopefully be debuting them on the channel soon. So before we go any further, I'd also like to say that thank you very much to all my subscribers. We've crossed an absolute critical threshold, which is that we are now at over 1,769, which I always said is going to be a crucial number. Some of you will know why already. It was, of course, the birth year of Napoleon and the Duke of Wellington as well. They were both born the same year. So to celebrate that fact and to acknowledge that, you know, the continued support of all my subscribers, I'm going to be doing a giveaway. I'm going to announce that this weekend. So that should be announced the weekend of Sunday, the 24th of November. And yes, so thank you very much. Anyway, let's get into the video proper. So I'm going to start a new series, and I'm going to look at the different battlefield roles that different elements of the armies had and how we can use them best in our games of Black Powder. Now, I don't think there's anywhere better to start than what Napoleon called the queens of the battlefield, and that's the infantry. Now, infantry is usable in two main ways. The first way is in attack, and the second way is in defense. I know it sounds sounds a bit silly, but they are a lot more flexible than, say, cavalry. They can only really be used in attack. I mean, there's things like scouting roles and things like that, but generally they are attack only. So in this video, we're going to look at defense. We're going to look at armies who are particularly good at defending, and we're going to look at tactics and formations that you can use on the battlefield to really help you in those defensive situations. So on the screen now, you can see a battalion of British infantry in their classic line formation. Now, this is usually the best formation to defend in. It allows you to get the maximum firepower of your battalion on the enemy, and it negates one of the biggest problems that troops have with being in line formation, which is it's very difficult to maintain that when moving forward. It was something that was used a lot in the 7 Years' War, and that's why armies there were so very heavily drilled, particularly the Prussians, because moving forward and keeping formation in line was quite hard, especially when you've got a frontage of, you know, half a mile or, you know, 0.6, 0.7 of a kilometre, for those of you using metric. So it's quite a long way, and it's difficult to maintain formation. If you're stationary though, it's obviously a lot easier. It also means that the enemy's artillery is less effective against you, because if you're in a British line, you're only 2 deep. Most continental armies had lines that were 3 deep. And just while we're here, that's something that's a bit of a pet peeve of mine. I can't remember if I mentioned it in the British infantry video or not. I probably did. That the British formed 2 lines, which meant that they had maximum firepower, but it also meant that their firepower dropped off a lot quicker than European powers. So in the British Army, every time you killed a man, you lost 1 musket firing back at you. So it was, you know, the drop-off is 1-to-1. Whereas in the Continental Army, say the Austrians, they would be in 3 ranks, you'd kill the first guy, so then the 2 ranks behind would move forward 1, so you'd have to kill that second guy to get rid of 1 musket firing. And when you're looking at particularly, say, Austrian battalions of, you know, 1,000 men, that's a much slower drop-off than the British had. And I think it indicates why there were longer exchanges of fire against the Austrians than there were against the British. But anyway, that's getting miles off topic. So the British line here is particularly good because they also have the steady line special rule. Now, we'll talk about that a little bit more later. For my money, they are the best defensive army in the game. There's another army that pushes them second, the Russians, but I think the British are the best because they've got this steady line special rule as well. Now, while I'm going to be talking about the British, these rules will apply, these principles will apply to the other nations as well, the Austrians, the Russians, the Prussians, and to an extent the French as well. The French weren't always the attackers. So the first thing I'm going to look at is formations. Now, by formation, I don't mean battalion formations like we've seen here, that's the line. I want to look at brigade formations, because remember, Black Powder is a brigade level game. The individual battalions, while it's important, it's really what we do with the brigades that's important. So let's look at a British brigade set up, in my opinion, for the best way of defending. Okay, so here we've got what I would consider to be a very strong defensive formation. We've got 4 battalions of British infantry, plus a battery of artillery. So we're looking really at a brigade here. And we've got the Black Watch at the front, I know they call them Night's Watch there. We've got the Black Watch at the front there, a unit supporting them, this time the Inniskillings. And then we've got the 33rd at the front there, and the Kings behind them supporting them there. Now, this is a particularly strong formation because it allows for redundancy, and that's key when we look at war games in general, and particularly in Black Powder. Now, what do I mean by redundancy? Well, it means that if the French attack and they break the front line, they haven't broken through. So we're assuming that there's formations to the left and to the right of this one here. They're not just isolated on their own. But what we're going to see is I'm going to put some French units on the table. We'll have a look at an example of what happens if the French break through. Okay, so I'll just pause the video here. You can see here on the left that 2 French battalions are about to get into contact with the British line. Now, this is one of the downsides of line. Because it's so wide, it means that more than one formation can contact them at the same time. Now, as per the supplements, only one of the French units is actually going to be able to fight. So, what we'll do is I'll move them in, so they can move in just automatically, because they're well within initiative range. I'll move this battalion out of the way, and put a dice rolling box in place instead. There we go. Right, so, the British player now has a choice to make. Well, they've got 2 choices to make, actually. They can either, just straighten out one, they can either shoot and get their normal +1 for stand and shoot, or they can save that and they can get +1 to their close combat rolling. Now, 99.9% of the time, I cannot see a time that you would ever use the steady line rule to give you +1 to your shooting. I can see it potentially if you haven't used your first fire yet, but overall, please save it for the combat. It's for one very simple reason. You shoot with this many dice, you fight melee with this many dice. You can either have +1 to 3 dice, possibly 4 if you haven't used your first fire yet, or you can have +1 to 6 dice. Now, the French, they are no better or worse against shooting as they are against close combat. So there's never really a reason to not get a +1 to 6 dice instead of your 4. So that's the crucial choice number 1. Do you use steady line to give you +1 to your shooting or +1 to your combat? Most of the time, you want to use it to do with the combat, not the shooting. So, with that one out of the way, the second point that we have to ask is, who do we fire at? Now, there's 2 ways you can fire. You can either split fire, so 2 on one and 1 on the other one, or you can concentrate your fire on 1 unit. I'm going to recommend that you concentrate your fire on 1 unit, okay? And the unit that you make it is the central unit, this one here. Now, that's for a specific reason. Square dice was doing my OCD in. Right, so the reason that you pick this central column is because the French player is going to pick who they do the combat with. Now, they ideally want to pick this unit here. The reason being, they are supported on both flanks. So they're going to get +2 to their static combat res. If they choose this one, then they're only supported on one flank. Okay? So, we're going to concentrate on this one here. So, they're going to do their closing fire. They're hitting on 4s normally, +1 because the French are in attack column. So, they've rolled... That was a cocked dice. So, I've rolled 3 hits there. Now, they haven't got any disorders. Fair enough. The French have now got their saving throws. So, they failed 2. So, 2 go through, but the unit isn't disordered. Now, I would be thinking at this point, if I'm a French player, if I use this unit here to fight the combat, I need to take 1 more casualty out of 6 dice that hit me on a 3+ for that unit to be shaken. Now, shaken units are next to useless, and not only that, they also take up valuable resources from the brigade commander as well. So, I would no longer use that one to fight combat with. I'd be using this one. Now, we're fighting slightly even. Let's have a look, see how it goes. So, the French player, he's hitting on 3s because he's charged, so he hits 5 times, very nice. So the British save on a 4+. So they save 3, 2 go through, so they've taken 2 damage. Attacking back, they're hitting on 3s as well. So, oh dear, that's a terrible roll. So only 2 hits. And the French take 1 damage. So, as you can see, as well as getting some markers, I've also moved us closer to the action. You can see on the back of the French movement trays, so this unit's taken 2 casualties, this one's only taken 1. And there's a British wound counter there, they've taken 2. So let's see who won that combat. This is the crucial part. So, the French inflicted 2 casualties on the British. Now, the way I often calculate these, or just use them to show really, is dice. The value on the dice doesn't matter, it's just purely the number of dice. So, they've inflicted 2 casualties. They are supported to their right-hand side, so they get an extra 1 for that, for a score of 3. Now, the British inflicted 1 casualty back. They're supported to their left, sorry, their right, our left, their right. They're also supported to their left, and they're also supported to their rear. So, left, right, and then rear. So the British win that combat by 1, despite having such a terrible dice roll, only getting 2 hits. They've won that combat. Now, let's also remember that they're up against 2 French battalions, and they've won that combat handily. They only took 2 casualties, and they caused 3. But, let's say, for the sake of argument, that the British lost that combat. And this is where that redundancy thing comes in. If this British unit, say they fell back 2 moves off the board, or just, back 2 moves, let's move them here, just get them out of the way. There you go, nice close up my arm. Then the British have still got this battalion here, so, sorry, the French have now got to deal with them, so they can move forward, for argument's sake. The British now, they get a turn of fire. Now, this is the crucial part as well, because they were behind the other British battalion. These guys haven't fired yet, so they're going to have their first fire bonus. Let me just get the old dice roller over here. Now, which unit are they going to fire at? Well, they're going to fire at this unit here. The reason being, they want to try and force them back. So, let's see how it goes. They're at point blank range, so they're hitting normally on 4s, +1 for being within 3 inches of the enemy, and +1 because the French are in attack column. So, there we go. 4 hits, including a disorder. Slightly off the camera there. 4 hits, including a disorder. Very nice. 2 of those are on 2s. So, very good. Let's see if the French can save any of these. They save them all. Lovely. But they are disordered. That's the crucial thing. Because it means that although they can still support in the British next turn, sorry, in the French next turn, that one must charge. And it means that once again, the British get their closing fire. So they're hitting on 3s. They're not using their +1. For a double disorder. Very nice. The French save 1. So they take another casualty. And they're disordered as well. I've only got 1 disorder marker. So I'll move that one over. Now in the combat. These guys disordered. They're hitting on 4s. The British attacking back with 6 dice, hitting on 3s. It's going to be very difficult for the French to break through there. Now, that unit that was in front, if they've fallen back in the British turn, they weren't shaken, so they could move up, and they could be in the rear here, supporting this battalion again. They won't get their flank support for the artillery. We didn't even fire them, but it doesn't matter. Hopefully, they've done enough damage to not even lose the combat. So that's a defence in depth, it's called. So that's why the 2 up, 2 back formation, I highly, highly recommend. There's also an argument for having 3 up and 1 back, but I'm going to talk in the attacking video about why that's not such a good idea. So that's the British. That's the best way for the British to defend, in my opinion. And also, in my opinion, the British are the best army in the game at defending. However, they're not the only army that can do it successfully. And I'm going to reset and we'll look at another army that's exceptionally good at defending. We're going to talk Napoleonic defensive armies. The best has got to be the Russians. Not only do they have General Winter on their side, but they had to fight and hold long enough for that to come into effect. Now, I say that the British are the best at defending, and I stick by that. I think the steady line rule really puts them up there. But the Russians, they have advantages too. The most obvious one being that they pretty much all have tough fighter. So while the French want to get into combat with the enemy, the Russians are actually man for man, or unit for unit rather, better than the French at the combat. They only have a 4+ save if they're in line, unlike, say, this French column here, which has the 3+. But they get to reroll one of their misses, and I think that doesn't quite balance it out, but it goes some way to doing it. You can see also on the left of the picture, the unit on the left, sorry, I'll just move the camera back a little bit, here we go. The unit on the left, they are grenadiers. Now, one of the things that the Russians have over the others is they have grenadiers coming out of their ears. They've got huge numbers of reliable, I use that in both the rule sense of the word and just in the general sense of the word, reliable infantry units that they can get to positions that they need to get to. And again, they've all got that tough fighter. They've also got another special rule, all the Russians, that comes in importance here. And that is their 4th point of stamina. They have more stamina than most other armies out there. And that just means that they can get heavily beaten in a combat and still not run away because they don't have those excess casualties. So, the Russians, let's have a look at the combat here. So, the French have charged. Let's roll this one out. Can you see it on the camera? I might have to move it over a little bit. So, there we go. So, the French have charged. They're hitting on 3s. So, a good roll this time. 5 hits. And the Russians are saving on 4+. So, they failed 3 there. Normally, that would shake the enemy, but not the Ruskies. They have stamina 4, so that's them there. Second round of combat. Sorry, not the second round of combat. The Russians fighting back, rather. So they're hitting on 4s. They hit 4 times. They've got tough fighter, so they hit a 5th time. The French column now has its save. So it fails 3. So there we go. I'll pop that there so you can see it on camera. The French have now drawn that combat. Let's say, for argument's sake, that no one's got any supports. The French are shaken. The Russians aren't. The French are taking a test. So let's see how that goes for them. A 10, they carry on fighting. Next turn, the French here are hitting the Russians on a 5. The Russians are hitting back on a 3 because they won the last round of combat. As per the supplements, the French don't get their column bonus. So I think that's pretty much going to be the end of that French column. So you've seen there, and that's purely because of that piece of that 4th stamina. Actually, sorry, just a correction of myself there. The Russians wouldn't be hitting on 3s because they didn't win that round of combat. It was a draw, they just didn't need to test. But you've seen there that Tough Fighter and the 4th point of stamina have combined to see this French column off. Well, you know what? Let's roll out the next round of combat. So the French are hitting now on 5s because they're shaken. So not bad, not bad. They get 3 hits. And the Russians managed to save one of them. So now the Russians have taken 4 altogether. The Russians attacking back. They're hitting on 4s. So not great. Only 2 hits there. Tough Fighter comes into it. Still only 2 hits. And the French, they don't get their column bonus, so they lose that there as well. So they're 1 over. So it's a test for the Russians, but no modifier. That's the crucial point. That was a terrible roll from the Russians. They're not on a modifier. If that was a draw, then the French would be. So that's why the Russians make excellent defensive units. So we talked about the 2-up, 2-back formation for the British, and let's assume that the Russians have done the same thing. There's maybe 2 battalions here or on the other side. And what we saw was when the first line were pushed back, or maybe when they were defeated entirely, then the British were able to open up with their troops who hadn't fired in the game yet, so they still had their first fire bonus. And then when they were charged by the French, they got the closing fire, and then they got the steady line, so they counted as charging. I would recommend against that with the Russians. The Russians have the special rule. The bullet is a fool, the bayonet is a hero. They also have, I think it's called pour powder. Not 100% sure about that one. But it basically means they don't get the +1 to hit for closing fire. So, in this case, the bullet is a fool, the bayonet is a hero, means that they can make an initiative move as long as it's to charge the enemy. That is exactly what I would be doing here. While they can stand and shoot, they'll be rolling 4 dice because they haven't fired yet. So they'll be rolling 4 dice. They'll be hitting on 4s because they don't get the +1 for close combat. They will get the +1 for the French being in column, sorry. So they'll be hitting on 3s on 4 dice. If they charge, they'll be hitting on 6, perhaps 7 dice if they're grenadiers like they are here. And they'll be getting a re-roll for Tough Fighter. So while the Brits want to get pushed back and then they stand and fire, it's almost like Zulu, you know, when they fall back and fire. The Russians don't want to be doing that. The Russians want to be charging when that front line goes. The Austrians want to do the same thing. I can't show you the Austrians because I sold most of my Austrian units. I'm going to rebuild them slowly. And they want to do the same, but they can charge in column or battalion mass. That's what they want to be doing, certainly from 1812 onwards. So the British, when the front line gets destroyed, stand and fire. Everyone else counter-charge. Particularly the Russians, they are far better in close combat than they are at shooting. And the Austrians, because they can charge in column, so that's quite tasty as well. They can also roll extra dice to stand and fire. I don't know. I have to think about the Austrians a little bit more. I may ask General Andy what his thoughts on the Austrians are. So that's how to use your brigade formations to defend a position. The key thing is, make sure that the units have support in combat. Make sure you target the enemy units that are going to stop them supporting each other in combat. And then when that front line gets broken, which it will do eventually, then you either want to stand and shoot if you're the British, or counter-charge if you're not British. That would be my recommendation. So that's it for the video. Thank you very much. I've kind of done this a bit old school on my phone, so I'm sorry if I gave anyone motion sickness earlier on. But the basic principles are the 2-up, 2-back formation. Try and have your guys in line if possible to maximise firepower. The second line, if you're Austrians or French, you can be in column and get away with that, I think. But try and maximise the amount of firepower on the enemy and play to your army's strengths. The British and the Russians, both very good at defence, but in very different ways. And I think that's the key. I think the best way of learning that is to play some games. But I will also be doing some videos on the play style for each different nation. I think it's probably the best way of describing it. So next in this series, we're going to be doing infantry on the attack. I've also got the Imperial Guard series to finish as well. I'm quite looking forward to that. And this Sunday, keep an eye out because there'll be an announcement video for the giveaway that I'm doing. So that should be quite good fun as well. So thank you very much for listening. Once again, I do apologise for it being so long since the last video. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll see you soon. Goodbye.